The following program is brought to you free of charge by the sponsorship of Novus Ordo Watch. See for yourself that the Church of the Second Vatican Council is not in fact the Catholic Church of the ages. Go to novusordowatch.org. That's novusordowatch.org.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the Anti-Modernist Reader on the Restoration Radio Network. I'm your host, Stephen Heiner, and today I am joined by Father Anthony Cekada, editor of the Anti-Modernist Reader. Father, thanks for joining us.
Happy to be here, Stephen, as usual. Always a pleasure.
We just recently recorded the Zero episode introducing this book, and we're on to Chapter 1. And Chapter 1 is actually taken from a pamphlet that Father wrote many moons ago. And it was called The New Mass versus the Traditional Mass, and that's the title of our episode today. Rather an obvious theme, I suppose, Father, but can you tell us about, I guess, 1988, way back in the 80s, we first saw this pamphlet?
Well, actually, if I can make bold with a correction, the article is initially called "Welcome to the Traditional Latin Mass," and the story behind it actually goes way back from 1988. When I was ordained a priest in 1977, you would get people who would be new to the traditional Mass. They would come out of curiosity, and they'd wonder what exactly some of the issues were. With the traditional Mass versus the new Mass. So it occurred to me from the beginning that there should be some sort of simple explanation, a pamphlet, which is what we used in those antediluvian days before the internet to communicate with people, that we could hand to them that would, in a simple way, outline the differences between the two rites. Well, when I arrived at Oyster Bay Cove in 1979, I came across a pamphlet that had the title "Welcome to the Traditional Latin Mass." It was put together by a man named Donald Fons. Don was a former Redemptorist seminarian who'd become a traditionalist. He lived in Walnut Creek, California, and he went to the Mass Center there that was run by one of the first priests of the Society in St. Pius X in the United States, Father Gregory Post. Father Post is actually still in the Society, although I think he's out of California now. But Don was a very good writer, so he wrote a booklet that introduced people to the differences between the traditional Latin Mass and the new Mass. It was very clearly written and very nicely illustrated. The difficulty with it at that time was that it tended to, as most of the traditionalist literature did that talked about the new Mass, talk about the question of for you and for many, and about the question of the validity of the new Mass, and basically leave the issue at that. It didn't really say too much about the other doctrinal difficulties with the Latin Mass, or with the new Mass. So I had this pamphlet sitting on my desk actually for a couple of years, and trying to figure out how it could be revised or what could be done with it. Well, what I did at a certain point in the 1980s is I decided that I would just write a pamphlet myself. Well, it turned out to be a rather complex and time-consuming project, but eventually by 1988, by the time we had in fact left the Society of St. Pius X, I managed to produce the first edition of it. Since then, it's gone through a number of different editions. We had to make some changes because of the question of the indult Mass and the appearance of different traditionalist organizations in the Novus Ordo circle, such as the Fraternity of St. Peter. Then there was the issue in the 90s under the influence of Ratzinger, the issue of new translations that were coming out. So a lot of the traditionalist literature objected to the new Mass on the basis of how the initial translations were really inaccurate renditions of the Latin. But that was being changed, and of course then that issue had to be addressed as well. And then finally there was the election of Ratzinger as Benedict XVI and his motu proprio in 2007. And that authorized worldwide the celebration of Mass according to the 62 Missal. So the subsequent editions of this little booklet that started out in 1979 underwent a number of changes as the situation developed in the post-Vatican II Church, and as we also discovered more and more about the difficulties that the new Mass, even in Latin, presented.
Well, and Father, you said 1988. Now, did you put this out before June of 1988 or after June of 1988?
Actually, I don't remember. I think it was before June of 1988.
Because I was going to say it might have become at least needed to be updated almost immediately after the Ecclesia Dei change. So it's interesting that you put together some timeless, or shall we say, classic principles in this pamphlet, but the circumstances kept changing under your feet, and hence you had to keep up with the Novus Ordo by having your own updated pamphlet.
Yes, that's right. That's right. It's our own sort of, I guess, aggiornamento, or what would they call it? Theological evolution, something like that.
Well,
but in any event, it was utterly traditional.
Right, we have the substantial anchorage of the 1988 edition, and which we can say is pretty much unchanged, except for some pictures. And again, as we've said before in the Zero episode, of course you can buy the Anti-Modernist Reader, and there's a link in the show notes. You won't be able to buy an autographed copy from Father Cekada anymore because all of those copies sold out in 120 minutes.
Yeah.
But if you want to follow along, you can just go to traditionalmass.org, and you can find this article on there. Yeah, as well as if you'd want to get your hands on a pamphlet, I suppose you could just fill out your information at sgg.org, and you'll be emailed a welcome packet, as I was a long time ago in 2006, and receive one of these pamphlets yourself, and that way you can get your hand on the original article and be part of the cool kids.
So interesting that it has had quite a circulation. It's never flagged in popularity. We still get requests from it from all over the world. So apparently it still does have an appeal to people.
Yes, and it was one of those safe ways that you can read some of Father Cekada's stuff without being associated with him and all of the horrible things that might come of being associated with a set of a content.
Yes, naturally, you wouldn't want that.
So when I think about this pamphlet, Father, I really your tone. Can I say it's somewhat like a horror movie, because the sense starts with. You're talking to somebody, and I think the listeners who are listening to the broadcast who are in the Novus Ordo, they'll read this and they'll feel comforted because you're talking to them on their level. So you're walking them through, here's what's going on in the traditional Mass. I know you've never been here before, but I want to tell you a little bit about it. Let me tell you about how the new Mass was created, which is what you go to. And then there's a heading called Irreverence and Sacrilege. And at that point, the the story takes a marked turn for the worse, and then you end with a heading called an invitation. So we're going to get to all of those things today, but I want to remind our listeners, I know there's plenty of old hands that are members of the network that'll say, Stephen, I know this story, we don't need to go over it again. That's fine. You don't have to listen today. We have lots of other content, but it's always good to review. And for the new people, the people who are still working through the changes and have questions, this is a good opportunity to basically go through the major arguments one by one. Father's been doing it, and his pamphlet has been covering that since 1988. So, unfortunately, this is a radio program, so you can't see the contrasting pictures that Father has in this pamphlet. One is a sort of guitar mass in the round, not even in the round, it looks like it's in someone's living room. And then there's a picture of Father Cekada, I suppose, with darker and more hair at the altar at their chapel in Sharonville. It looks a lot smaller than the chapel in Westchester, so I have to guess that this is not at the current church location. And it does a very good contrast. You have these people sitting around playing the guitar versus Father Cekada, facing and preparing for Mass or celebrating Mass, actually. So I suppose that's where you're starting, Father, is right away. Anytime you've had people come to St. Gertrude's or wherever you've been for the first time, what do they come up and tell you? Apart from the people who say, oh, Father, I haven't seen this for 20 years. What happens when the young people come up to you who've never seen it, full stop?
Yeah, I would have to say that the reaction is pretty much the same. Someone who is curious and of goodwill comes to a traditional Mass. They've never experienced anything before. And one of the first things they tell you is, boy, it's so different. It seems so peaceful and so spiritual. And that's the typical kind of remark that you get, or that it seems so holy. So, and these are people who walk in off the street who don't really have some sort of a profound theological background, but right away they see that there's a difference between what they've been getting in their parish church and what they see when they wander into the traditional Mass.
Well, and I suppose I can speak for myself. The reaction I had as someone who, up till the 17th year of his life, had only seen the Novus Ordo, be it ever so respectful within the milieu of the Norbertines or the Dallas Cistercians that I got a chance to witness, that it was night and day. Even a very humble, low indult Mass, which was the very first traditional Mass I ever attended, I had the same reaction as all those young people that had attended. Although I instantly knew that something was different. And you make this point right away. Father says, if you remove from public worship prayers and gestures that allude to a particular truth, such as this, and this is referring to the real presence, you can be fairly sure that in time, worshipers will cease to believe in it. And I wonder, at what point did that happen for us, Father? Because, as I say, my parents, you could say, adhered to sort of conservative Catholicism, and they raised us to believe some of these basic truths of the Catholic faith, even though we were situated in the Novus Ordo. So I think we in this crossover generation. At what point do you think that the Novus Ordo was so widespread that we had widespread loss of disbelief? Did it take 10 years, 15 years, 20 years?
Well, as the older generation started to die off or really be converted to the changes, that it was a gradual process, to the point where by the time you get into the late 80s and the early 90s, you start seeing polls that reflect opinion polls that reflect this loss of belief in something like the real presence. among Catholics who actually go to church. They look upon it as the presence of Christ as something merely symbolic or analogical or something like that, where they no longer actually hold and adhere to what the church adhered to before. But it's a gradual process. It's a gradual chipping away. And you see how the praxis is used to chip away at belief and at as what is revealed. It was an issue that we're talking about with regard to Francis's program about marriage. That sure, marriage is indissoluble, but then there are pastoral ways of applying this principle to people who are in difficult situations, blah, blah, blah. But what you have happen then over a period of time is that the principle ends up being elided and being thrown down. So too the question of the real presence or the special nature of the priest at Mass, what his function is, what his role is. All these things have underwent a change over a period of time with the liturgical changes. It's something over a period of years, maybe 2 decades, where 2.5 decades after which it's the old belief is pretty much undermined and gone.
Well, and Father cites a biography of Luther under a heading, Making Catholics Protestants, which might be the first thing to really unsettle you in reading this pamphlet. And it says, next came the reform of the liturgy, which touched the common man more intimately because it altered his daily devotions. He was being invited to drink the wine at the sacrament, to take the elements into his own hands, to commune without previous confession, to hear the words of institution in his own tongue, and to participate extensively in sacred song. So Father goes on to claim that we see these changes that sound familiar to us in Luther, and that this is what Catholics were being prepared for. But you then make the point, Father, that in order to understand that, we have to go back further and beyond this point to Vatican II. And again, assuming that our audience knows about the existence of Vatican II and knows some of its points, I think it is helpful to say that immediately you point to the fruits and you give some statistics. You might share some of those statistics as to judging Vatican II by its fruits.
Well, we were told, of course, myself having actually lived through this area, that it was going to produce all sorts of really wonderful fruits, that people were going to be drawn to the Catholic Church, that the liturgy would become much more popular and much more comprehensible for people, that we would reach more and more people throughout the world. But what in fact happened, and again, this is something the process once started to see take place almost immediately, is that you have that vocations started to dry up, vocations to the priesthood. I remember all the incidences of priests quitting the priesthood during the post-Vatican II era, the seminaries being closing down and emptying out. Both of the seminaries that I studied at, the Prep Seminary High School in Milwaukee and the Seminary College, both of those institutions, bit the dust very soon. The big religious orders that were very into the idea of Vatican II and the so-called renewal and change started to nosedive, and nuns were leaving right and left, mostly, I guess, to the left, which is where they ended up. And then you get to a certain point where there's no respect anymore for the Church's moral teachings. By 2000, you find that 85% of Catholics denied that artificial contraception was morally wrong, and then that 65 of them believe that Catholics can divorce and remarry. So what you end up with is this process that has started in the 1960s that has all of these fruits that are terrible, that are poison for the faith. So it's the liturgical changes we situate in the context of that.
Well, and Father, you point out, if we don't want to stretch, I don't want to stretch the fruits and plant analogy too much, but we can see that we have bad fruits or no fruits from, shall we say, bad fertilizer, and there is a whole lot of bull probably being put into this tree, and you identified two particular ones. Obviously, Vatican II has a lot of bad principles, but you point towards ecumenism and modernism. And again, just as a point of review for our newer listeners, can you define those for us?
So when you talk about ecumenism, this is generally the principle that seeks to put Catholicism together with non-Catholic religions. So the idea is to reduce Christianity to a series of necessary common truths that everyone has, that all who call themselves Christians supposedly believe, and other things such as things that the Catholic Church teaches about different doctrines. These can be ignored as non-essential. So on one hand, you have this idea of accommodation to false religions. On the other hand, along with this is modernism. And the heresy of modernism teaches that the truth changes from age to age. The truth evolves, and that what you see proclaimed as truth in one age by the Church is looked at from a different perspective, under different circumstances, and therefore has to evolve to meet the principles of the modern world and a modern philosophy. So you have those two general principles that are behind Vatican II and behind what came from it. When it comes to the liturgical reform, the difficulties with the liturgical reform, the traditionalist writings initially tended to, as I said, to concentrate on the invalidity idea and on the other idea of the new Mass as an ecumenical celebration. But left out of the equation in much of the early writing was the idea of modernism, the evolution of dogma, and how that was embodied in the new Mass and was used to spread these modernist ideas throughout the whole world. So while people realized that yes, it's ecumenical, they didn't latch on right away to the modernist problem with it.
Well, and as you say, the liturgical outgrowth is what is the point of the pamphlet. Obviously, the council is a larger issue, but if you start with the principles of ecumenism and modernism within the council, how do you apply ecumenism and modernism to the liturgical reform? Father makes this point on two levels. One, ecumenism, because you want to satisfy Protestants. You need to make things a bit more amenable to our, shall we say, separated brethren. I can't really say that with a straight face. And then modernism leads us to simply getting rid of or changing things to please modern man. Now, at this point in the pamphlet, a skeptical reader or someone who's starting to get a little bit shocked by what you're saying, Father, might say, well, how do I know this isn't just some conspiracy theory of Father Cekada? I mean, where did he get this? Where did he get these ideas?
Well, what you do is you have to look to the writings of the people who are responsible for the creation of the new Mass, and they will tell you that these were the two principles. Bugnini, who was in charge of the reform, for instance, said in the Osservatore Romano, the Vatican newspaper, right away, in an article in the 60s that he wanted to remove from the liturgy, from the Reformed liturgy that he was producing, anything that would give offense to their separated brethren. So you have your ecumenism idea there, and then elsewhere you find in the writings of those who produced the Reform the idea that we really have to make this accommodation to modern man, that we have new values and new perspectives. So we have to remove from the liturgy ideas that do not please modern man. So such as ideas such as hell or punishment for sin or separation from the world and so on. So that you get them speaking about this rather openly, but remember, again, these days it was much more difficult to get this sort of information. You had to, find the obscure liturgical publications that these people were writing for, and you had to understand Latin or Italian or German sometimes to figure out what they were talking about. But at least as in terms of the time, they were quite open about what they were up to.
And I'm just sort of boggled, Father, at the leisure of my generation, contemplating research without Google Translate or Google itself, and it just sounds so tiring. Although, to be fair, I did experience a little bit. I know about this ancient invention called the card catalog. I once used at this place called a library that had books and not computers in it. So, as you say, if you don't understand those languages or you don't travel to these distant places to get your hands on the source documents, you can get away with this for a long enough time until, I hesitate to use the democratization of information, but basically making it more widely available. People can get in. People, so I say troublemakers like yourself can get in and look at the text and start to draw stronger conclusions, as you say, from the people who were behind it themselves.
Yeah.
I think it's sort of indictment. So then Father goes on to talk about the definition of the Mass that was within the 1969 General Instructions. And I suppose as a testament to how poorly catechized I was as a Novus Ordo, challenged myself to think about whether the first time I read this without a commentary, I was able, as a conservative Novus Ordo, to point out why this was heretical, not just weak. And the definition is the sacred assembly or gathering together of the people of God with a priest presiding to celebrate the memorial of the Lord. Because Novus Ordos are not necessarily brought up with these dark black and white lines, I think a Novus Ordo person could read this and say, all right, Father, the sacred assembly or gathering together of the people of God with a priest presiding to celebrate the memorial of the Lord, it doesn't say that there isn't a sacrifice, and aren't all these things going on at Mass? What's wrong with this?
Well, as you say, that would be the typical reaction, and which show that someone has been marinated, as it were, in the world of the Novus Ordo. But the primary definition and understanding of the Holy Sacrifice of the Mass is a sacrifice offered to Almighty God, and it's the consistent teaching of the Church. What you have is the modernist method of skipping around the definition of an essential definition of what something is to give you a little to convey another idea to you. And the idea that this conveys to you is, well, what you see is what you get. So you have an assembly there and people are gathered to celebrate the Lord's memorial, and that's what you get, and that's kind of the only really important thing about it. So the other doctrine recedes into the background.
Well, and I suppose at this point we can go into some of the things that were changed, and we should start right away with the penitential rite. And I thought, again, as I was preparing for the episode, Father, I had to go back, and it's one of those unfortunate things when you come to Catholicism from the Novus Ordo that I'm sure all Catholics like to think fondly of. This is the season for First Communion, yes, and I'm sure that any Catholic likes to think back with happiness, hopefully, to First Communion and those days. And I thought, especially in this season, and as I was prepping for this episode, I thought, well, I can't really look back because I'm not certain that I received First Communion. I'm not certain that it was a validly celebrated Mass. I'm not sure that it was a validly ordained priest, and so I've sort of shut out a large part of my adolescence, the memory of my Catholic memory, because of this. However, for our listeners and for purposes of the episode, I went back to dredge up some of these memories, and I thought to myself of how robotic sounding some of these things are. I'm thinking of, it says here, penitential rite, and I can hear the priest saying, "You came to call sinners, Lord have mercy," and then the audience / congregation says, "Lord have mercy." You did such and such. Christ have mercy. Christ have mercy. And it's we all, whether we were fervent or not. I'm not saying that everyone was, bored and not engaged. I think there were people like our family. We were trying to. In fact, I even followed along in my missalette, which gives the lie to the fact that because it was in the vernacular, I was able to understand Catholics, can't break away from their training, and we were still I was following along in my missalette. That's what my father had taught me to do. But this, even right away, you can see in this penitential rite, I could say it is truly penitential to have to sit through something like that.
But at least it's short.
Right.
The penitential rite, as mentioned in the pamphlet and elsewhere, actually, the common penitential rite was something that the Protestants came up with in the 16th century. So you had in the traditional Mass, what you had is the Confiteor and everything was really a priest-oriented prayer of preparation, prayers of worthiness. So this was replaced with a more with a common penitential rite, and this again was to make another theological point that this Mass is now offered, as it were, by everyone on a more or less equal level, the people and the priest. So that's why we have this common penitential rite. So it's telegraphing that idea to you.
The second thing is the offertory, and this was probably what hit me in the gut a lot more than any other part of the Mass, was when I first read the Suscipe Sancte Pater, the first prayer in the offertory in the traditional Mass, and realized this prayer was gone. And I think, and I can't remember who said this, I don't remember exactly who this is attributed to, Father, but that the entire Eucharistic doctrine of the Church is contained within that first Suscipe prayer. And no surprise, it's missing. And in its place, we have some prayers which some of our listeners might not know where those prayers came from.
Yes, there was a writer in the 50s whose name escapes me, who pointed that out, that it is like a little summa of the Catholic doctrine on the Holy Sacrifice of the Mass. And so it is a very important part of the Mass in terms of the doctrine that it expresses and the description that gives you of what actually is going on in the supernatural order. And in its place, we have some prayers, the origin of which may be unknown to most people. We just say it. Blessed are. It ends with blessed are. Well, it starts with blessed are you, Lord God of all creation. What is it? Through your goodness, we have this bread to offer. Yes. Something, work of human hands, which may have been a good title for a book, I suppose. It will become our spiritual food. I'm for Novus Ordos, I'm sure you know it a lot better. It's been a long time since I've heard it, so I don't remember it verbatim. But where did those prayers come from, Father? Those prayers were actually a Seder blessing, the Jewish table prayers, and those were modified and used to replace the Suscipe, which was a clear expression of Catholic doctrine. But you have to remember, too, if you talk ecumenism, that obviously the language of the prayer Suscipe was such that it was quite offensive to Protestants, so it had to go.
Well, and I suppose you don't have to go back. I mean, you're not even going back to Protestantism. You're going back to people who don't even believe that Jesus is the Messiah.
Yeah, that's right.
So you're definitely. I mean, consider your sources for this. We then move away from one single Roman canon, and we move to the era of the Eucharistic prayer, but not just the idea of having different options, but Father, the entire posture of that part of the Mass is different. Those of us who go to the traditional Mass, we're used to it being basically completely deathly quiet at that point. You are required by rubrics to use a different tone of voice than you use for other parts of the Mass, whereas this has always been included. We know which prayer the priest is reading because we let's say we're following along in our missalette, but it's done out loud, and also the words of consecration are not separated out. Can you explain to our listeners what the institution narrative is and how that relates to the words of consecration and why that's different substantially?
So the idea there is of consecration at the Mass. The traditional theology is that the priest is reciting here and now in the person of Christ, is affecting the change of the bread and wine into the body and blood of Christ. So something is happening here and now in the real order. This idea of a transformation was something that was repugnant to Protestant theology and to modernist theology as well. So they used the term for it, institution narrative. In other words, the minister or the priest is telling a story of what occurred long ago. And he's sort of repeating this little story for your benefit. And I can testify from my own experience as a church organist who used to go to different parishes to substitute for other organists and to play for Mass, provide the music for Mass, is that the younger clergy, in fact, did follow this norm, that the way they carry themselves, they were telling you a story at the Novus Ordo, telling you a very nice story. So there's that shift again away from Catholic theology of the real presence and transubstantiation.
Well, but Father, you have to say, if you're going to tell a story, you might as well get the actual text correct, right? If you're going to quote our Lord, you might as well quote him accurately. And in some translations, we saw our Lord's words changed. Now, I remember being a young, impressionable trad, many, many moons ago, and one of the bona fides of going to one of these trad masses would be to see one of these older gentlemen with a very proud pro multis pin on his jacket with his tie. And I always just sort of, I thought at the time, I just sort of chuckled to myself, and I thought, these people are standing up for pro multis, in the country of bumper stickers. But it is really important, because I had conservative Novus Ordos like the Norbertines and others tell me that this was not a substantial change, that this was, this is translation, that Hebrew, that Aramaic didn't necessarily have a distinction for this word, and neither did Greek, and ergo, we could take that to also not need to have a signification for us. So on behalf of anyone who may have had the same, shall we say, explanation given to them, Father, how would you respond?
Well, first of all, that was a big issue, that into English and into most modern languages, the word multis and the words of consecration over the chalice were changed from for many to for all. So there definitely was a change there, and it was done with in the translation with the intention, in effect, of altering the meaning of the traditional understanding of the text of consecration. There's a difference between many, obviously, and all. So the idea is that we're introducing here this idea of ecumenism, and the idea of the wearing down of distinction between members of the church and those who are not members of the church. So all of this is sort of packed into it. The difficulty with that particular issue is this, that while it is very true in the vernacular languages, in Latin, of course, the original Latin version of the Novus Ordo, it remained entirely the same. So you could not make that particular argument, as it were, against the Latin version of the Novus Ordo. So it certainly was the intention of the creators of the Novus Ordo to change that the meaning of that phrase when it was rendered into the vernacular.
Father, do you agree that this is the smoking gun within the liturgical reform in the same way that subsistit in is a smoking gun within Vatican? And not saying there's only one smoking gun, but one can point to and say, look, here's a substantial change that was done for no reason. And then it's tried to be excused like, well, you're overreacting. The conservatives would always put to me that I'm overreacting. Like, oh, well, subsistence, Stephen, you can say, it means the same thing. And I was always puzzled by this defense of something that was quite obviously an intentional change. It wasn't as though they didn't have a thesaurus with them that day and they just decided they would go for the next closest word. This was, propaganda.
Well, sure. I mean, they told us, but again, you'd have to read the writings. They told us that this was correct. That the people who were in charge of liturgical reform said that this is really what they wanted in the vernacular. So from that point of view, it is definitely a smoking gun as regards the meaning, and as regards the overall sense of the form. They took words that were not considered part of the form in the traditional Latin Mass, and then made them part of this narrative of institution. So what you get is you get a narrative, in effect, with a quote in it. So, I mean, they're footprints of what they were up to. It's really all over the place.
Father makes some other points in the pamphlet about a removal of veneration of the saints, reference to the faithful departed, and negative theology. But because we're recording this episode around the same time that Father and I have done a Trad Controversies on Holy Week, where we talk on a lot about these issues, and a Work of Human Hands episode, where we talk about the oration and a lot of these, I'm going to refer you to those two episodes to hear more about the loss of those elements, because we still have a lot to cover, and I don't want to have the episode run too long. I want to get us to the fruits of this. So we talked about the fruits of the changes in a sort of long way when Father was referring to vocation loss and nuns leaving. When we look at this, the fruits of the liturgical reform, I suppose part of it has to come from just horror stories. And Father, I suppose you've been out of it a little longer because you saw the Novus Ordo at its very inception, and I came to it when it was in full swing. And I even feel my horror stories are somewhat mild by comparison. I remember one time there was a group of us, college students, conservative, Novus Ordo college students, and we had taken a day trip somewhere in New Hampshire, and we needed to go to Mass. It was Sunday. We found a parish somewhere, and we stopped in, and much to our surprise, at the very end, we were treated to some liturgical dance. And keep in mind that all of us were conservative. Most of us were digging our fingernails into each other's arms to make sure we wouldn't laugh in front of everybody, because we thought everyone in the audience, was enjoying this. On the other complete other side, when I first moved to the United States in 1988, and I was around 9 or 10 years old, and I didn't realize at the time the parish that I attended was called St. Rita in Dallas, and it was a very progressive, very, very progressive, both school and church. And I wouldn't know that as a child, but looking back, I look at the things that we did. One of the things that we did in religion class was to compose a mass. And everyone would have, someone would play the priest, someone would play the lector, and the teacher even led by saying, unfortunately, due to directives, girls are not allowed to play the role of priest, but I hope this may change in the future. And you would think this is 1988, this is 1989, and this is still going on. So we would have that, and during the prayers of the faithful, we would have people extemporaneously shout out. And we always knew there was this one old guy who was on the right-hand side, and when the time would be given for people, he would pipe up and he'd say, "For an increase in religious vocations, we pray to the Lord." And it was sort of, everyone would wait for this guy because we knew he was going to say that. Everyone gave him his space to say it. But other people would just sort of shout out these things, and it was really, I look back at it now and it was extraordinary that was my Catholic life that I thought of was my quote-unquote Catholic life. And I laugh at it. I mean, I realize it was a Novus Ordo life and has nothing to do with Catholicism. But there are many people out there who are listening to this broadcast who I'm sorry to say, you've been defrauded, and you need to be woken up to the reality that that has nothing to do with Catholicism. And I don't know if you have some
as I'm listening to your anecdote, though, it makes me think. I wonder how many of the people in your class who were subjected to this sort of religious formation at that period in time are practicing anything that even resembles remotely the Catholic faith now. Because in my own experience, the young people who are brought up with this sort of nothing version of Catholicism, the feel-good version of Catholicism, where there's not too much knowledge, certainly of the faith, and certainly not much inculcated to you in the way of Catholic morality or Catholic liturgy, generally end up not even self-identifying as Catholics anymore. So it's I guess gets us back to the issue again, a little bit of the fruits of all of these changes. You know, that it would be very interesting to find out what happened to your classmates.
Well, and I'm sure that my fourth grade religion teacher would feel like she really hadn't done her job because look what she's created, or helped to create, I suppose. But I have to imagine, Father, that an organ player wasn't really the mode after the changes. I mean, you must have found yourself unemployed.
Well,
or were you thinking of taking up guitar, maybe?
Guitar never appealed to me for some reason. Well, actually, the reason I took up the organ, in addition to having an inclination toward music, was because of the awful liturgical music that started up right away in the early 1960s. In fact, I even studied musical composition so that I could learn how to write decent liturgical music. So the guitar was never a temptation. I made it a point in 8 years in the Novus Ordo Seminary that never opened my mouth once during one of those wretched guitar pieces.
Well, I suppose then we see that there's a couple points of objection. So, Father, people are going to say that, well, I have access to a traditional Mass. Father, I go to the Fraternity of St. Peter, I go to the Institute of Christ the King, and if and when the SSPX ever signs an agreement, I go to the Society of St. Paul. I go to these places where things are handled correctly. And that's one school of thought. The other school of thought, which I've heard often, even from some of our listeners, people who write to us, to say, well, I'm staying and I'm fighting within the structures of the church. And I suppose there's a couple things wrong with both of those approaches, Father. But I'd like you to share your thoughts on why those are not great approaches.
First of all, when you end up in groups like the Fraternity of St. Peter's, supporting initiatives like that, naturally you end up being neutralized, which I think is a very good word. You end up in practice accepting the underlying tenets of the Novus Ordo religion, and you become a part of that, and your silence, in effect, ends up sort of being purchased by the permission that you get from the modernists to stay in your corner and to have your nice liturgical ceremonies. So it's you end up theologically being bought off. If you end up in a group like the Pius X Society, they of course still recognize the legitimacy of the modernist hierarchy, and this is something. This leads to theological absurdities. The idea that the people who are in fact preaching these heresies and who have instituted these evil laws and these harmful ways of worship could somehow continue to possess the authority from Jesus Christ himself. So you run into a problem there as well. And in both cases, SSPX or indult type of groups, you ultimately end up reducing the liturgical problem to a question of the Mass, that we can have an approved Mass here, Latin Mass off in the corner without worrying about the larger theological issues, the larger theological problem that Vatican II produced. The new Mass that both these groups reject is a product of larger theological problems. And simply by reducing the issues to the Mass and staying over in your own corner or getting approval somehow for your own apostolate, you lose the rest of that perspective.
Now, while the approach may be flawed, Father, would you agree that it's motivated by a Catholic spirit because Catholics want approval? We want to do things with permission. We don't want to go off and do our own thing. So these people they're reacting with the Catholic spirit, but they're taking the wrong approach.
Yeah, and that's certainly true, because we all of us went through that. We had the problem of authority, like how can this be, and how can it be that our beloved Holy Father Paul VI, who's doing so much to defend the truths of the Catholic faith, how can it be that all of this stuff is going on? Leave me alone.
He only knew it was going on.
Yeah, if the Pope only knew. So you end up in that sort of quandary, and this was the problem for many priests from the older generation who retained the traditional Catholic faith in their hearts. That they did not. They knew they had to have permission. They had to be under the local bishop. This had been drummed into them, and they couldn't possibly go against this. So I have a sympathy, certainly, for people who are starting out trying to figure this out, because I certainly was in their position at one point myself. But, you have to look at the principles that the Church has laid down and look at them logically and think them out and apply them. And eventually you get to a correct conclusion.
What about the approach that I'm staying to fight within the structures and I'm fighting the good fight? How about that approach?
Well, first of all, it doesn't work. And that's something that we know from experience. This has never succeeded. You end up being giving legitimacy to those people who are spreading error, and nothing is ever done anyway. Certainly not. You can see I remember trying to fight against liturgical abuses with a conservative priest at the seminary. We compiled dossiers of the different liturgical abuses and violations of the rubrics that went on, and presented them to actually to the chancellor of the archdiocese. But nothing ever comes of that. Right? No one was ever reproached, and the liturgical abuses were allowed to go on. The same thing with when in the new church, when you have petitions and fight against so-called doctrinal problems, that the whip never truly is cracked. People are never excommunicated from the new church. So you're wasting your time by saying you're staying on the inside and fighting. You're not fighting. You've surrendered, and you're going to lose.
And I think too, Father, all the tactics you would use as a conservative, you'd see this family coming down the aisle to receive communion. The women are all strangely wearing these dresses, and one might even have a veil on. And for some reason, they're all moving towards Father's communion line because they're not going to receive from one of these quote unquote extraordinary ministers. And then you see this sort of horror on their face as Father, he's all done distributing communion, so he retires from the rail. And now they're stuck because they're heading towards Father's line, and now these other Eucharistic ministers. And I remember looking over at this family, and I'm thinking, well, what are they going to do? And they end up going, right? And then my own remember going to daily mass, as the Romans say, 2 cats and a dog. Daily mass in the Novus Ordo for me was 16 old people and me, the 17-year-old. And one day after Mass, the ponytailed Father Doug, and I'm not making that up, his name, he went by Father Doug, he decided that he was going to make an example of the youngest person who dared to genuflect before receiving communion. I wasn't even doing the quick break your knees on and off bit. And he said, since the Second Vatican Council, we don't do things like this. And then he looked directly at me and he says, you don't need to, make a statement. Mass isn't about you. And I thought to myself, oh my gosh, all I was trying to do, I was just sort of shocked and embarrassed. I'm 17 years old. All the old people are looking at me like I'm a jerk. And I waited until everybody leaves Mass, and I just started crying. I started crying right there in church. And I was thinking to myself, like, what did I, Lord, what did I do wrong? I wasn't trying to, draw attention to myself. I think I even went last in line so I wouldn't hold up anybody because, the most important thing is getting communion distributed as fast as possible. That's the big value in the Novus Ordo, which only lasts 20 minutes anyway at a weekday Mass. And that was one of those moments that I would share with, and I've shared it in other forums, but for those listeners who are in the Novus Ordo, I bought into the stay within the structures thing too, and that's what I got. I'm not saying that we as Catholics aren't called to be humiliated, but I wonder, it's not just a matter of humiliation. For someone younger, it may lead to questions about their faith, that they're being reproached for simply trying to show reverence, and then they question, well, maybe I'm overdoing it. I don't really need that. This is the part of the story, Father, and I want to remind our listeners that you are listening to the Anti-Modernist Reader on the Restoration Radio Network. All rights are reserved. Any duplication without explicit written permission is forbidden. You can obtain permission by writing to mail, MAIL, at truerestoration.org. Father, I alluded to earlier that you had a horror story for us, and I suppose this is the dread for our Novus Ordo listeners who are going to come to the end of the story and say, well, Father, you're going to say, I don't need to go to Mass. What about Mass on Sunday? Where am I going to go? And you're not telling me I can't go to Mass anymore. I mean, I had to go to the Novus Ordo, and I suppose in another episode we can address the question of validly ordained priest and validly set Mass. But broadly speaking, what's the conclusion you're offering to people, and why?
Stay away from the Novus Ordo because it is evil. That it harms. It is irreverent. It presents the antithesis of what should be the Catholic faith. It's an offense to Almighty God, and there's also the question of invalidity and of sacrilege. Now, this takes us back for a moment to what we talked about before, that the inclination of people who have retained the Catholic faith, vestiges of at least large parts of the Catholic faith after Vatican II, have the idea that, well, the good Catholic is obliged to go to Mass, that it can't be a real Sunday without a Mass, that you're committing a sin if you do not assist at Mass. So therefore, I have to go to the Mass that's the Novus Ordo, even if it has all of these terrible things. But the idea is that really the law of assistance at Mass is a church law. It's one of the commandments of the Church that tells us how to fulfill the commandment of the divine law to keep to keep the Lord's Day holy. So that's one consideration, that it's a church law. And secondly, the purpose of the church law is to worship God in a worthy and true fashion. And you don't get that with the Novus Ordo. So you stay away, as you would stayed away if you were a Catholic in England after the Protestants took over the churches there, that you had no obligation whatsoever to assist at the Protestant service. You stayed away from it because it was erroneous and heretical and an offense to Almighty God. And it's the same principle that applies here. We're in Catholics find themselves in a bad situation. They would like to have access to the Mass on a Sunday, but they don't. So they're not bound by the commandment or by the law of the church as long as they're in that particular situation. And indeed, they would be forbidden to go by the divine law because of what the Novus Ordo is.
Well, what can they do instead, Father?
Well, we had Catholics would try to render holy the Lord's Day by reciting the Rosary, by reciting different Mass prayers. Sometimes in an area, families would gather to do that, as was done, when the United States was simply a missionary country. There are still people from families that we have who assist in Mass here who remember doing that as kids when they didn't have access to a priest in a particular area. So there's that possibility. Now, because of the wonders of the Internet, now you can actually assist at a Mass and hear a sermon over the Internet. It's not the same thing as actually being present in terms of fulfilling your Sunday obligation, but it is a very good way of sanctifying a Sunday, and it's one of the benefits of our technological age. So we webcast live all of our Sunday Masses from St. Gertrude the Great.
It certainly isn't your father's trad movement anymore, is it, Father?
No, it certainly isn't.
Well, and with that, I would encourage our listeners to visit sgg.org to find out about those webcasts. If you want to get your hands on the original pamphlet that inspired part of the articles that led to a book, you can apply for that by asking to be on Father's mailing list and requesting the pamphlet. Or you can get a copy of the Anti-Modernist Reader available at truerestorationpress.com. As always, Father, thank you so much for your time, and we look forward to having you on future episodes of this series.
Always a pleasure, Stephen. God bless you all.
We want to remind our listeners that if you have any questions for Father or feedback on this episode, we'd love to hear from you. You can contact us at antimodernist@truerestoration.org, and you can send your comments and questions there. All of us here at the Restoration Radio Network would ask that if you found this show to be informative, helpful, or in any way beneficial to you and to your faith, that you please consider sending a note of thanks to the clergy who help make our network worthwhile. Remember that above and beyond material contributions, the most important donation you can make to our work here is prayer. Please think of offering a Mass, a Rosary, or even a simple Ave for our work the next time you pray. For the Restoration, I am Stephen Heiner. May God bless you.
This program was brought to you free of charge by the sponsorship of Novus Ordo Watch. See for yourself that the Church of the Second Vatican Council is not in fact the Catholic Church of the ages. Go to novusordowatch.org. That's novusordowatch.org.